Hey friend, how are you feeling? I know that there is a lot going on right now, and I don't know where you are listening from, but we are all in this together. Obviously, we are many weeks into the coronavirus COVID-19 outbreak epidemic, and life is crazy. Life is hard for a lot of people. And so I'm just checking in with you, and I just want to see how you're doing. I genuinely mean it when I say I want to hear from you. Shoot me an email. You can email me hello@stillbeingmolly.com. Find me on social media @stillbeingmolly. Shoot me a DM and let me know how you're doing and how I can pray for you or how I can help you in any way, shape, or form. I just want to say thank you for taking time out of your day to sit here and listen to this podcast. I know that a lot of times for me, sitting and listening to a podcast or an audiobook is just a nice escape. So I want to hopefully continue to bring encouraging and inspiring content to you throughout these unprecedented times. I'm actually recording this little intro from my office at home again, and it feels, I'm glad to be at home, but it feels weird if I'm being honest. This interview that you are about to hear was recorded many weeks ago before the outbreak began. So if you are wondering if we reference anything to being out or anything like that, just know that this was pre-recorded. Well, I should say that before I go into my formal introduction, I just want you to be thinking. We are communal people by nature. We are meant to live in community. We are meant to be in relationship with one another. And right now, while we're social distancing and while we are, 6 feet apart from everybody outside of the ones that we live with, and while we can't be with our friends and we can't go out and have a party or anything like that, I know that it can feel really strange and you're wondering, what are my relationships going to be like? How am I going to be able to communicate with my friends and not feel distant from them, just by using apps like Zoom or Marco Polo or texting or whatever it is? If you're married, maybe your marriage is struggling right now because you and your spouse are in really close proximity. And obviously, it's really important to be focusing on those relationships and the people that matter most. And so my conversation with my guest today could not have come at a better time. Welcome to Business with Purpose. I'm your host, Molly Stillman of Still Being Molly, and this show is all about bringing you the stories behind the brands, companies, and small businesses that are changing the world. Each week, I interview an entrepreneur, CEO, nonprofit director, community leader, or just an incredible person who is trying to make a positive impact, not only through their personal life, but also with their career. My goal is to show you that no matter what you do for a living, you can make an impact wherever you are. My guest this week is Nicole Zasowski, a licensed marriage and family therapist, writer, and speaker. She lives in a small town just outside New York City with her husband, Jimmy, and her son, James. With the vulnerability of your closest friends and the wisdom of your most trusted resource, Nicole reveals her own story of how challenges such as unwanted transition, multiple miscarriages, and crippling anxiety gave her empty hands to receive everything she had been looking for in the presence and person of Jesus Christ. She's also the author of the new book, From Lost to Found, Giving Up What You Think You Want for What Will Set You Free. I loved this conversation, and listening back to it over the last week or so has just really ministered to my heart, and I know it will to you too. So without further ado, on to my conversation with Nicole. Nicole, I am so happy to finally have you on the show after what has felt like many, many months of talking back and forth. But I think of that quote or the scripture in Esther, like, perhaps we were made for such a time as this.
Yes, absolutely. I'm thrilled to be on. Thanks for having me. And I'm glad this finally worked out for us to connect.
I know. Well, I first heard you on a podcast interview a year or two ago, and just was really inspired by everything you shared. And then I've just continued to kind of follow your work loosely on social media. And now you have a book, like a book baby. You just birthed a book baby, which is amazing. And I just have to like go ahead and just give you a round of applause because like I know how much work goes into that. And it's called From Lost to Found, giving up what you think you want for what will set you free. And I basically binge read it in a few days, a couple of weeks ago, and it's wonderful. It's such a gift. And so first I just want to say congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Because I know how much work goes into that. And then second, I just want to say thank you for putting it out into the world and for the gift of sharing your story with others.
Oh, thank you. It was my pleasure, and God did a lot in my own heart through it. So I'm very grateful.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. Well, before we kind of dive into your story and the book and all that kind of stuff, just tell us about you. So give us the Nicole 101. Tell us who you are and kind of how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So my name is Nicole Zasowski. I am a marriage and family therapist, and mostly that work includes my private practice in Greenwich, Connecticut, just outside New York City. But I am also on staff at an organization called the Hideaway Experience, which takes me down to Georgia about 4 times a year. And I am a co-therapist at a marriage intensive experience is what the Hideaway Experience is. So we work with 4 to 5 couples for 4 days, and it's really intense, and intensive is a good word for it, but it's extremely rewarding. So that's my therapy work. And when I'm not doing that, obviously I'm a writer. I just published my first book at the end of January, From Lost to Found, like you mentioned. And that's a book that weaves my personal story with my therapy experience and faith journey. So I did not realize that I was personally missing out on the freedom that I was so passionate about helping my clients find for many years. And it wasn't until I confronted my own painful season that I realized that I actually had not been practicing any of the things that I encourage my clients to practice. And so the book outlines that journey, and I'm sure we'll get into more details there. And my greatest joy is being a wife and mama to my 2 young boys. I've got my oldest son is going to be 4 next week, and then I have a 3-month-old.
Well, you obviously have so much on your plate, so much in your life. And so I'm just always, I'm just in awe of all that you do. But I want to back up a little bit because I've always been very curious about this.
Sure.
To people who pursue a career in counseling and especially like you're really specialized in the marriage counseling and being a family therapist. What was it in your life that you were like, yes, this is what I want to do is I want to sit in a room with some couples who are real pissed at each other and help them work it out. I'm just kidding.
Well, you're not too far off, actually.
Yeah, that's true. So like, how did you get there?
Yeah. So, I do specialize in working with couples, and I feel like family work tends to come in mainly when I'm working with my adolescents. I do see a lot of individuals as well. Marriage and family therapy is more of a way of looking at a person. It's a way of thinking. So basically, anybody I see, whether it's an individual, a couple, a family, I've learned to think about them and hear their story in the context of the family they grew up in or systems that they're a part of currently. It's just kind of a relational way of thinking. But to answer your question, I studied abroad my entire sophomore year of college. That's just sort of the way my college did it. So 70% of sophomores are actually gone. And it was kind of a unique setup. I lived with 50 other college students from my school in one house. So it was sort of like a co-ed fraternity situation.
Yeah.
It was very unique.
Very unique.
And we had been living with a faculty family also came over with us for that year and lived in the house as well. And I I feel like when you're away from your home environment and you're with the same group of people for such a long period of time, there's just some really unique conversations that emerge, especially with a bunch of 19 to 20-year-olds who are, asking those questions, who am I and what's my purpose in life? And I just loved the depth of conversations that I had that year. And I found that I sort of became, my nickname was the house therapist. I sort of became a person people would go to with different struggles. And I really liked it. I liked those deep one-on-one conversations. I would say I've enjoyed those my entire life. And I'm kind of an old soul. So it was a natural fit for me in that setting. And the faculty family that went with us happened to be the head of the psychology department at my college. And to this day, she says she's never done this before, but I'm really glad she did because I think it's what I needed. She took me out to coffee at the end of the year. We were about to go back home. And she just said, "Are you sure you don't want to be a therapist?" And it was literally one of those moments where I felt like God just turned the lights on. And it became so obvious and clear to me that, yes, that's what I wanted to do. And I never looked back. I switched my entire schedule and started taking classes in psychology and went straight into my graduate program in marriage and family therapy and really just loved it more and more. It's certainly challenging work. It's an interesting fit for my personality. As you read in the book, I really struggle with performance and like to feel adequate and know that I am have what it takes for a given task. And so often in therapy, it's messy, right? It's
Right.
dealing with people, and there's no clear-cut answers a lot of the time. So I will say it is a job that keeps me tethered to the hope of Christ and His strength, because it's, like you alluded to, it's certainly not for the faint of heart and not something I could do on my own.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I know that you share this in the book that you and your husband, you moved from California to
Yes.
Connecticut, and that was a really tough transition for you at first. Obviously, those are two pretty different places in California, Connecticut, different cultures, different temperatures, all just different ways of life. And so you've now built, but you have built over time a successful practice there. Do you just meet in person? Like, do you have an office, or do you meet virtually with anybody?
So the laws around marriage and family therapy are, they're kind of interesting. And I think this is probably evolving, and I'm certainly not an expert in any of this, but to answer your question, I mainly meet in person.
Yeah.
And that is primarily because depending on where you live, I'm not licensed in other states other than Connecticut, and the license needs to be where the client is. So if somebody called me from Iowa, I am not licensed in Iowa, so it's not possible for me to have a client in Iowa.
That's fascinating. I definitely did not know that.
Yeah, it's very odd. You would think that they would nationalize it, but so far that's not happened yet.
That is crazy. Yeah, I definitely did not know that at all. Now, I also, now my listeners obviously know this because this is how I am, but I am one of those people who I tend to ask questions that I just maybe selfishly want to know the answer to. And because I also like to assume that other people want to know the answer.
Go for it.
So as somebody who is a marriage and family therapist and is also married, how does do the two ever play together? Like, do you ever, like, in your own marriage, sit there and like psychoanalyze your own marriage? Or has that encouraged like you and your husband to seek counseling, just as, like, I know a lot of couples who are just like, we go to counseling regularly because it's good for our marriage, not because we're like, on the verge of divorce or anything.
Sure.
How has that played out in your own marriage? That's
a great question. First of all, people sometimes ask me, do you have all the answers? Do you win all the time? And I'm like, absolutely not. If anything, it gets me into more hot water than not. I have much to learn, and I am married to a gem. So I think that's the first thing I would say is it's helpful for me and us to just have a posture of, you know what, we're all learning and growing here in this life, and no one is the expert when it comes to, relationships. And yeah, I've learned a few things at school, but it's an entirely, and through my work with clients, but it's an entirely different thing to apply it to yourself. And the second that I lose touch with how much I need to learn and grow is, the moment that I'm in the biggest trouble.
Yeah.
So yes, my husband is actually somewhat trained is a strong word, but he is familiar with the model of therapy that I use because my mentors started it. It's called restoration therapy. And while I was a graduate student at Fuller Seminary, we were living on campus. We had just gotten married. We were engaged the first year and then married the second year of my program. And we did like a psychoeducation group. So it wasn't therapy per se, but we were a part of a group that used this material. And so he is familiar with the way that I work. And I try not to ask my clients to do anything that I wouldn't do myself. So we're working on it with the same model and tools that I use with my clients.
That's great. That's great. And that's really encouraging. And because I just think, the more that we can not only destigmatize just regular counseling and therapy, but, destigmatizing marriage counseling. And, so often there's just this kind of assumption that if you hear that, oh, somebody is in counseling, then things must be in trouble, know, and that was how I viewed counseling for a really long time, and didn't go to counseling until I was in my 30s and had experienced, a second trimester pregnancy loss. And then all of a sudden I realized that, 30 plus years of grief were now manifesting themselves in, and I was like, I should probably go to counseling. And that was the best decision I could have ever made. But I wish I'd gone earlier. But so much for me in my own head, I was just like, oh, if I go to counseling, then it's me admitting that I have a problem or that something's wrong with me. And I think that similarly in marriage and family counseling, if we say like, oh, we're in marriage counseling, or, oh, we're in family counseling, then, oh, there's a problem. There's something wrong with us. When that doesn't have to be the case.
No,
it doesn't have to be the case. And I have a friend who, she and her husband are in business together, and they have had a marriage counselor and coach for 4 years. And they just said like, they love it. It's like vital to their business because they have to be able to communicate together. And, it's like, my husband and I, coincidentally, as we were recording this, today is our 8-year wedding anniversary. And I know.
Congratulations.
Thanks, we're the best. Obviously I know this airs in April, but it's fine. But we actually, this just past weekend, went to our first marriage conference, and it was at our church, and it was fantastic. But there was one thing in particular that just at this analogy that stuck out to me, and it's going to stick with me forever. There was obviously a couple things that really were great, but this particular analogy I just loved because I love analogies. And it's very similar to an analogy I would use. And it's that, if you own a car, what do you do regularly? You fill it up with gas. You take it to get the oil changed. You rotate the tires. You change the tires. You do the 50,000 mile, 100,000 mile checkup, all that kind of stuff. If you don't do that, what happens? Your car starts to break down. Eventually, a wheel's going to get wobbly, or the tread's going to run out, or you could end up on the side of the highway with no oil, no gas, and you're 100 miles from a repair shop or a gas station, and suddenly you need help. So why do we take so much effort to maintain our cars, but we don't do the same with our marriages? Like, we put our marriages on autopilot, and we do nothing to maintain them, to put, what's the marriage equivalent of like filling it up with gas, going on a date night, like having time alone? Like, what's the equivalent of the 50,000 mile, 100,000 mile checkup a week away by yourselves without kids?
Right.
Like, no excuses, and I've heard people who are like, oh, well, we can't, like, it's too expensive. And I'm like, you know what else is expensive? Divorce. Like, I'm just saying.
You can't afford not to.
Right. And yeah, exactly. So anyway, I could obviously go on a lot about that, but yeah, I think it's so important to break down those stigmas.
Absolutely. And I think we're getting a little better, but we have a long way to go. One of the first things I usually say to people when I sit down with them for the first time is, look, I'm more human than therapists. Like, I'm not sitting here with, perfection and, with nothing to work on myself. Like, we are all in this journey together. And if I can use what I've learned through my training and my work with couples to help you along, just know that I need that too in my own life. Yeah. And you're exactly right that and isn't that the way that the enemy works in our lives in general? Like, if you, here's another analogy for you. If you want to plant weeds in your garden, what do? You do nothing. Right. The weeds it's not like you have to be intentional about planting the weeds there. That's just what happens when you aren't intentional about the most important relationships in your lives or personal growth, that weeds start to grow and, 1 to 2 degrees off early on. If you add time to that, those boats are pretty far apart. Yeah. And so I love hearing your perspective on that. I think it's spot on that maintenance work is the best work we can do when it comes to cultivating health and wholeness in our relationships.
Right. And then sometimes you got to get that car detailed. You got to buff it up real shiny. You gotta vacuum it out. I don't know where we're going with this analogy now, but I like it. I'm here for it. Okay, I'm going to take a quick break from my chat with Nicole to share with you the Spring/Summer 2020 collection from Seiko Designs. The spring collection launched a couple of months ago, but the summer collection is launching this month. So there is a lot happening at Seiko Designs. There is a spring sale happening. So many beautiful goods that are fair trade, handcrafted, and pieces that are going to just absolutely get compliments no matter when or where you wear them. And right now is a time where we should be really looking to shop small, support small businesses, fair trade and ethical businesses, because we know that those artisans, those people, they need jobs. And so by purchasing these beautiful handcrafted fair trade goods, you are helping to provide a job for a woman in need, both overseas and right here in the US. So to shop the incredible collection, go to SeikoDesigns.com/Molly Stillman. That's SSEKO Designs.com/Molly Stillman. Now back to my conversation with Nicole. Okay, obviously I could talk to you about this particular topic for a while, but I want to transition a little bit because one of the, obviously we could sit and, you wrote an entire book about your story, so we could really kind of go through the different parts, but I just wanted to share, like, as somebody who has experienced 2 second trimester miscarriages and back to back in a short span. I really resonated with, spoiler alert for those that haven't read the book, where you shared about your multiple miscarriages and your fertility journey. And you shared so honestly about that. And then now obviously here you are on the other side. Now you're a mom of 2 precious babies here on Earth. And could you just share a little bit about that and what that journey was like for you, but how it really is woven into the grander narrative that you shared in the book?
Sure. So you mentioned my move across the country that I talk about at the end of the first chapter of the book. Little did I know that was just the beginning of a season that could largely be characterized by change and loss. Within that season were 5 miscarriages, 2 before my first son and 3 in between my 2 boys. And while I certainly lost tangible things in that season, including those, the chance to meet those 5 babies this side of heaven, I believe with all my heart that God is not the author of our suffering, but I also know that He loves us too much to waste it. And what he did through a season of a lot of change and a lot of loss in my life was took my hands off of false securities that were promising way more than they could deliver, but had always sort of quote unquote worked for me in terms of feeling valued and safe. And so he took my hands off essentially idols that I had relied on for way too long to feel significant and secure. And I was left empty-handed when those things didn't work for me anymore. And that was really painful. Not only was I reeling from the loss of these 5 precious babies, but also, totally unsure of where my identity came from and what was going to make me feel safe. But what I learned in that process was only empty hands are open. And Molly, I still wouldn't say that I think I would be brave enough to choose that story for myself. It's not what I would have written for us had I had the choice. But I ask myself this all the time. Would I have preferred to carry on with my comfortable way of living in my false and small idea of who God was, and with the relationship I had with him at the time I thought it was really good, but what I know now is so much more of his character, and there's such a deeper intimacy between the two of us. And that has been the biggest gift to me. So, those open hands were open to receiving a totally different picture of who God is and a new relationship between the two of us that I don't think I would trade. I say in the book, on the far side or in the midst of pain we don't prefer, we find transformation we would not trade. And that isn't calling that tragedy good, but there's a difference between something being good and something being worked for good. And I think the Bible makes that distinction.
It's so, so good. And I really I said this at the beginning of kind of this segment, but I really did resonate so much with that story. And even more now, hearing you kind of explain it a little deeper, really connected with me again, because I have said the same thing where, in the 2 years, 18 months to 2 years since we experienced our losses, I've had a lot of people that have asked me questions like, aren't you mad at God? Or did you, how did you maintain your faith beliefs through that season? Or how did your relationship with God kind of pan out? And in so many ways, I have said, I'm just look, if the question that I struggled with in my losses, and I don't know if you had this same approach, but, I've dealt with death and loss in my life, but this was the first time that I'd ever really walked through it as a believer, because I didn't become a believer till I was in my mid-20s. And it was the first time that I'd really, really faced real grief in that opportunity. And so I always felt like God was saying to me, you have 2 choices. You can either run away from me, which you've done before, or you can run towards me. So it's really your choice. And I continuously it's not that I would get mad at God or even really question him. It was more a matter of, I kept looking, sometimes I would literally look up at the sky and just be like, what are you trying to teach me here?
Yeah.
What is the purpose of this? And I think that, really now 18 months to 2 years kind of removed from it, I have kind of come to that peace that, as we read in Philippians, the peace that surpasses all understanding, that guards our hearts and our minds in Christ Jesus. That to me is what I learned, is finding my peace and my identity in him, and not in my role as a mom, not in my role working or anything like that. And so if the only thing that comes out of that grief and that tragedy is that my relationship with Jesus is closer and stronger, and that I have a peace that surpasses all understanding, then so be it. Then so be it. It's not that again, exactly like you said, it's not that I would choose it, but the relationship that I have with Christ right now versus the relationship I had, 2 years ago, prior to our loss, like I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Yeah.
And it's such a bizarre thing to say for most people looking on the outside, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's such a nuanced thing. 'Cause like you said, I don't think, God is throwing these lightning bolts of suffering down into any of our lives. I think that this world is a broken place and it's a painful place. And, it says in God's word, you will have trouble. Not you might, but you will. But he also said he's bigger than that trouble. I have overcome it. And I think that is the hope I continued to lean into. And this is just what you were saying, that our hope is not necessarily in what God can do for us, but in us, and that he will not waste any of it and use it to, bring us more into his likeness and bring us closer to him. I think the choice that you faced, running away or drawing close, my form of running away was to perform for God at first. Like after that first one, I thought, okay, if I can show him, this is exactly how I approached all pain prior to this. So we will definitely play out with God what we play out with other people. And it was so clear to me in this situation, because after my first one, I kind of caught myself like, if I can show him that I've learned my lesson, if I can be really mature with my grief and all these silly things, but what it did is it kept me from being really vulnerable and honest with God and doing just what you did and looking to the sky and saying, what is going on? Like, what is this about? What do you have for me in this? And I think it's chapter 7 of the book where I get really honest at the end of just my raw questions, my raw feelings, my fears, and my hope in putting those in print, which wasn't easy, was that if anybody else was kind of keeping a question or a comment or a feeling protected from God for fear of what it might sound like, or, that he can't handle it, that would give, offer them some freedom and courage to just speak those to God. He wants them. And, inviting him into those places that we've been taught to keep the doors closed on.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, like, really also looking at, like, I love what you said about just God's character and how you really got to know his character, because I felt the same way. And there's just this misconception in society by Christians and non-Christians that it's like, well, if there's a God, then like, why does bad things happen?
Yes.
Like, why do bad things happen in the world? And it's not that God's up there like, let me send all these fire bolts of grief down there. Like, no, that's not what's happening. But what really comforted me was looking at the way Jesus grieved in his time on earth, and both in the death of his friend Lazarus, like how he sat in grief with his friends, even though he knew that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Yet he's still taking that time to grieve and to grieve with his friends. And he's not trying to like be like, stop crying, I'm going to raise him from the dead. Like everybody can relax. Like, no, he let the moment breathe. But then the other time is really just looking at him in the Garden of Gethsemane and how as he's so grieved that he is quite literally, like sweating blood, and how intense his grief is. And it's really interesting. I was actually reading an article the other day that was kind of looking at that particular passage and the science behind it. Like there's actually like a scientific explanation as to what was potentially happening. And at that moment is that if you are it's physically possible that if you are under so much stress and your grief is overcome, your stress is overcome, and your capillaries, like your like actually could burst. And so like it is quite literally possible that he was under so much stress. And so, I mean, he had the weight of the world, the sin of the world on his back, and he knew what he was about to face. And like, think about the stress that he was under. So like his blood was literally like bursting from him. And so like, if you sit there and you think about the grief that he was facing in that moment, like he's God, he's fully God, but he also like, he chose to be fully man as well, so that he could come into our full human experience and feel grief with us, and then give us the gift of the example of allowing yourself the ability to grieve. But then what did he do in that grief? He turned to his Father. Mm-hmm. He prayed and he took that to him. And so that was really comforting to me. And that was really where I really began to kind of see God's character in as you're walking through seasons like that.
Yeah. And how blessed are we to serve a God that we know has experienced our human experience.
Yes.
And I love that Lazarus story. Particularly, I think there's other pain that is like this as well. But just since you and I have had some similar experiences with miscarriage, I don't know if you heard this a lot. One thing that people told me, particularly since I think mine were a little earlier on than yours, but it's so common. It's so common. And which I personally found very unhelpful.
Girl, I could write a whole blog post with all the things. I'm like, here are some things you should not tell someone.
Okay. So you've had some of these comments as well. Yeah. And as common as pain is, it's still not normal.
No.
There's a difference between something happening a lot and being normal. And I love that we get to see Jesus's grief over Lazarus, again, like you said, fully knowing it was going to be okay, right. But just that pause of, this is not the way it is supposed to be.
Right.
And how we sell ourselves and others short when we try and talk each other out of our grief or explain it away, and how profoundly unhelpful and disconnecting that is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so, when we try, I actually read, there's another, and this was like a New York Times article that somebody had shared, but it was like the way that we as humans just typically initially react to grief is, again, usually trying to explain it away, or we try to, make comments that are like, oh, well, that person's always with you. Like, their presence is always with you. Or like, we try to then center ourselves and we say like, oh, but I didn't lose my mom, but one time I lost my dog, and like, things like these things are not helpful. No. Like I have lost my mom. Like, I lost my mom in high school, and like, let me tell you, like, I love my dogs. The passing of my dogs does not compare to the passing of my mother.
It will not be the same.
No, it's not the same. No. It's not the same. And so, and so I was like, a lot of times it's just the most helpful thing you can do is actually just kind of sit there with that person in their grief. And actually, you know what? Sorry, this just occurred to me as we're sitting here talking about this. The perfect example of what to do in someone's grief can be explained through a children's book. And the book is actually this book called The Rabbit Listened. And you're going to all go and buy it right now. I'm just kidding. But
awesome.
It's a book that my son has, and it's called The Rabbit Listened, and it's by, I'm looking it up, it's Corey, Cori Doerrfeld, Doerrfeld. And I'll just give you the quick little like summary of this book. So there's a little kid, and little kid named Taylor, and Taylor's building a big tower, big castle made of blocks. And it's this massive, massive construction, constructive thing. And it crashes down. And Taylor is extremely upset about the fact that this massive castle block thing got built and then got knocked down. And so throughout the book, all these different animals come and offer solutions. And so I think there's a bear that's just get really mad. And then there's a chicken that comes along and is like, oh, well, we'll go knock down somebody else's because it'll make us feel better. Or so all these animals come along and offer all these different solutions, and Taylor is not having it. And at the end, this like sweet, cuddly little rabbit comes up, like nuzzles up to Taylor and just sits there. And then Taylor eventually starts to talk about all the different, like goes through the stages of grief where it's like, oh, my tower got knocked down. And, but I want to go smash somebody else's tower. Or like, I want to just cry about it. I want to get angry, all these kinds of things. And then eventually like Taylor just feels better. And then Taylor and the rabbit rebuild it together at the end. And it's like, it's just sweet. It's a children's book, but it's a sweet picture about what like empathy looks like. Mm-hmm. It's not that we have to fix it. We don't have to go in there and just like offer all the solutions. Sometimes just like sitting with someone in their grief and allowing them to grieve and process and talk, showing them kindness, showing them love and true empathy. Like that's what people need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I just ordered that book on Amazon.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It's so cute. It's a really cute book.
Yeah, it sounds great. And I think you're spot on, and it feels so counterintuitive. An analogy I use a lot is, why would you go sit in a mud pit with somebody? Our tendency is to, throw them a rope and a life raft and all these things that we think are going to quote unquote fix it, when really the most helpful thing, and slower is faster when it comes to this, is just sitting with somebody.
Right.
In the grief.
Right.
And so they know that they're not alone, and not that you are incapacitated by it, but that you are there with them.
Right. Yeah. Oh, man, I learned so much from kids' books. Are you the same way?
Oh, same. My goodness.
Now, there's some really
bad ones. I feel like I totally got a whole new understanding of the Bible when I started reading the Jesus Storybook Bible to my son.
Yes. Yes. My husband and I said the exact same thing. It's our favorite kids' Bible. Yes. Amen. Preach.
Yeah. I'm like, oh, that's the point of that story. It just helps us, get down to the basics that we all need. Yeah. And really pulls out the most meaningful truths. So I am a huge children's book fan.
Yes. Yes. Actually, funny enough that you say that, because so I've been taking just some online seminary classes.
Oh, great.
This is the first time I'm actually sharing this like publicly, other than my husband knowing that. It's not, I'm not
honored.
I'm not in seminary. I'm just taking some seminary classes online. And one of the classes that I took, like the professor shared that like when he is preparing a sermon, he actually rehearses it for his kids first. And he wants to make sure that he is explaining things in a way that his kids can understand. Because if his kids can understand it, then adults can understand it. Wow. But I loved that. I was like, that's a good nugget. Like, I'm taking that. And I think the Jesus Storybook Bible is a great example of that. And I mean, don't get me wrong, like there's some real bad children's books out there, but there's also just like, there's just sometimes when we put stories or we explain things in a way that is on a child's level, like it speaks to that inner child within each of us.
Absolutely.
Okay, Nicole, I could literally sit here and talk to you all day. You're so fun.
Same.
And clearly we were supposed to have our conversation this day because it's been so amazing. And thank you for kind of like, I had no plans to like sit here and actually like also unload my heart as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you did.
But you really, your book is fantastic. I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there for the listeners. Go get Nicole's book, From Lost to Found, Nicole Zasowski, Zasowski. Go buy her book. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, basically wherever books are sold. Buy it, review it, share it, all the things. Nicole, before we go, it's my favorite part of the show. And that's where we get to just ask some fun, lighthearted, get to know you questions. Are you cool with that?
Yay.
All right. Cool. All right. So question number 1 is, what part of a kid's movie completely scarred you? Everyone has that movie.
Yes. Gosh, that's such a good question. I think the one that comes to mind is when I watched The Little Mermaid. well, I was probably 4.
Yeah.
I hated that ending. I was still am so incredibly attached to my dad. And I was like, why would she do that? Why would she leave the ocean and never see her dad again and marry some dude? Like,
That she barely knows.
yeah.
Also,
come
she's
on.
like 16.
Yes. I mean, come on.
That's hilarious.
So I distinctly remember like wandering into my dad's study where my parents were talking and just sobbing. Like, this just does not sit well with me. And
That's
am I going to have
hilarious.
to do that someday? Leave you?
This is hysterical.
Yeah. Another hilarious one is I went to a private Christian school, K through 12 school. And I came home from first grade, which is actually I was homeschooled for kindergarten. And I came home and I said, Mom, I was hysterical. Mom, I watched an inappropriate movie at school. And she's thinking, okay, how bad could it have been? You're 6 and you go to this Christian school. And I know they have some standards about what they show. And I was just sobbing uncontrollably. And apparently it was the best Christmas pageant ever. And I was so upset. They were disrespectful to Jesus because they were like ripping the baby to shreds, They were fighting. So apparently I was quite traumatized by that one as well, but I don't remember that.
That's so funny. I love it. That's amazing. Okay, question number 2. What is something you would do differently if you knew that no one was going to judge you?
Goodness, I love that question. You know what? What's been on my heart is I feel like I am praying for more freedom when I speak. Like speak in a formal setting. Like when I'm asked to give a talk, either therapy related or related to my book. Like I want to be more bold. And I feel like the performance and the fear of maybe judgment or offending people is maybe holding me back. And I would like more boldness there.
That's good. That's good. I like that. That went deep. I like it.
Yeah. So it's just for fun questions, right?
No, I like it. I like it. I like it when things go deep. Okay. Question number 3. What is something that I would never guess about you?
Oh, never guess about me. That's a great question. I like to drive really fast.
Yeah, I would not guess that.
Yeah, I think most people, I'm a pretty responsible looking, feeling person. I think most people's experience of me is that I'm pretty buttoned up and responsible. But I think if I wasn't a therapist, it'd be really fun to be a race car driver. I love to drive fast.
That is really funny. Have you had a lot of speeding tickets?
Surprisingly, no.
Oh, you're careful about it.
I'm careful about it. I'm smart about it. But this is still an issue.
I love it. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Okay. And then my last question is the question I ask all my guests. And that is, what does it mean to you, Nicole, to run a business with purpose?
I'm sure this is a fairly common answer, but I think obedience in the moment. And my career has taken a lot of different turns in the last 10 years. It's looked different than how I thought it would in some ways. But I think as long as I am keeping my ear to what God has for me in a given season and that what I am doing is congruent with what He is calling me to do, I think sometimes we as women, I like the idea of balance, but I think we can get over focused on it, and it produces a lot of pressure to feel like we have perfect balance in all these areas of our lives. And for me, I think when I prefer the concept of congruence is what I'm doing, is how I'm spending my time congruent with what I feel like God is calling me to do in this season. And that seasonal dreaming piece gives me a lot of freedom because it might look different than last season or next season. But for now, this is what I feel like obedience looks like. And as long as I'm continuing to ask that question, I feel like having a business with purpose is the natural fruit of that.
That's so good. That's so good. And no, that has not really been a common answer. So I really appreciate that.
Good.
Nicole, this really has been a joy, a treat, a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for your transparency and your honesty, and for the work that you're doing. And people go buy her book, and I will have all of the links and how to get in contact with Nicole and connect with her on social media in the show notes. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Molly. This was a privilege and a pleasure to talk with you.
I would love to know what you loved about this episode or something that you learned. If you do, let me know on social media. You can find me at Still Being Molly or at Business with Purpose Podcast on Instagram or Facebook. Don't forget to use that hashtag Business with Purpose Podcast. Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode. If you are a first-time listener of the show, welcome. Be sure to visit the archives for past shows featuring amazing entrepreneurs and business owners who are literally changing the world with their businesses. And if you are a regular listener of the show, thank you for tuning in and week out, and thank you for your support. Be sure to head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Radio Public, basically wherever you listen to podcasts, and click that subscribe button. By clicking that button, it helps to make sure you never miss a new episode of the show. And while you are there, would you mind taking a moment to leave a review? Leaving a review helps me to know what you're liking and how the show is personally impacting you. This show is produced by Third Wheel Media. Thank you so much for listening, and go do something good with purpose on purpose.